Hollywood did not begin as a sanctuary of art. It began as a gamble. In the early 20th century, when America was still searching for a way to tell its own story, a group of young filmmakers left the constraint-laden East and headed west in search of opportunity. California at that time held no magic, only abundant natural light, cheap land, and enough distance to escape the legal grip of powerful monopolies. Yet it was in this seemingly raw and unpromising place that a collective dream was planted. Hollywood was born with a distinctly American promise that anyone could become something greater than who they were. That poverty, background, and past could be erased beneath the glow of the spotlight. For millions of immigrants, the first movie posters did more than advertise entertainment. They advertised hope. On screen, people did not age, did not fail, did not break. All pain was edited, reshaped, and resolved with a smile. But that dream was never free. As Hollywood grew, it built more than studios and theaters. It built a closed system of power. The major studios did not simply make films. They controlled the entire chain, from training and casting to promotion and the management of public image. Actors, especially the young, entered Hollywood as if stepping into a contract with fate. In exchange for being seen, they surrendered autonomy over their own lives. Hollywood learned quickly how to turn people into symbols. A name was no longer an individual, it was a product. A face no longer belonged to its owner, it belonged to public expectation. Perfection became an obligation. Mistakes became threats. Silence became a condition for survival. On the surface, early Hollywood shimmered with pure light. Silk gowns, radiant smiles, red carpets, and carefully staged love stories. But beneath that glossy veneer lay a harsh reality. Contracts bound actors with rigid clauses of control. Physical appearances were molded to studio standards. Voices were trained. Private lives were monitored. Romantic relationships were arranged or concealed to protect marketable images. Hollywood did not encourage people to exist in their full complexity. It demanded simplification, a consumable image, a believable story. And when a real human being began to diverge from the role the public expected, that person became a problem to be managed. During this era, personal psychology barely existed in Hollywood's vocabulary. Depression was seen as weakness. Exhaustion as unprofessionalism. Fear, trauma, and emotional pain were buried beneath flawless makeup. Those who could not endure the pressure were replaced. Those who spoke out were sidelined. And those who remained silent, no matter how much they suffered, continued to be placed under the lights as living proof of the American dream. The greatest danger of classical Hollywood was not its cruelty, but how normalized that cruelty became. An entire industry was built on the shared belief the human cost was necessary to create magic. The press helped maintain the illusion. The public unknowingly reinforced it through unconditional admiration. And the studios, as storytellers, held absolute power over what could be seen and what had to disappear. Over time, cracks began to show, not through loud scandals, but through quiet collapses. Young stars who aged too quickly, deaths labeled with the word accident, lives fading into obscurity once they no longer fit the perfect image Hollywood had constructed for them. The Hollywood dream continues to spread across the world, but from its very first moment, it carried an irreconcilable contradiction. To create the illusion of immortality, someone must be sacrificed. And to preserve the light, the darkness must be pushed aside to a place where no one is allowed to look directly. This is not the story of one individual. It is the story of a system, a grand promise built upon silent compromises. And this is the foundation upon which every tragedy that followed would eventually rise. When Hollywood entered its golden age, power did not disperse. It concentrated, and it concentrated in the hands of very few. The classical studio moguls were not merely producers. They were architects of fate. In the world they created, actors were no longer independent artists, but tightly managed assets, no different from cameras, sets, or props. The classical studio system functioned like a closed factory. From scouting and training to contracts, casting, publicity, and press control, everything operated within a sealed circle of power with no exit. Once an actor signed a contract, they almost completely lost control over their own life. They could not choose their roles. They could not appear freely in public. They could not love, marry, or live as they wished if it conflicted with the image the studio had designed for them. This power did not need to be enforced through open violence. It was far more effective when disguised as opportunity. The studios understood that as long as the dream remained scarce, people would submit willingly. With thousands lining up outside studio gates every day, any act of resistance could be replaced instantly. The system created an absolute imbalance. On one side stood those who controlled the future. On the other were young people, often from poor backgrounds, carrying hopes of transformation. Within this disparity, control became normalized. Studios dictated physical appearance, demanding weight loss, weight gain, facial alterations. They controlled voices, posture, even the way someone smiled. Every detail had to fit the mold the market demanded. Private life was not exempt. Relationships were monitored. Romances were staged. Marriages that conflicted with the star's image were concealed or dismantled. Public relations departments functioned like defensive machinery, ready to distort the truth to protect the star brand, not the human being behind it, but the commercial value of the image. Creative freedom, so often celebrated by Hollywood, was in reality a rare privilege reserved for the very few at the top. Most actors lived in a constant state of anxiety. They knew that a refusal, a gesture deemed uncontrollable, could freeze their careers. No public blacklist was needed. Simply stop casting, stop promoting, stop mentioning them. Their existence would slowly fade from public memory. In such an environment, fear became the most effective tool of management. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being labeled difficult. Fear of being seen as ungrateful. Fear of losing everything they had just begun to gain. This fear forced many to accept conditions they would never have agreed to under any other circumstances. The classical studio system did not encourage individuality. It rewarded compliance. Those who fit were elevated. Those who differed were worn down until they conformed. And if they could not be reshaped, they were discarded quietly, without scandal, without explanation. Most troubling was how this system was legitimized by surface-level success. Films sold tickets. Stars were celebrated. Audiences were entertained. Few questioned the cost behind the scenes. And in that silence, power continued to operate unchecked. The classical studio system created legends, but it also produced another legacy, far less discussed, a legacy of control, fear, and people forced to trade away their true selves to sustain a flawless illusion. Psychological fractures began forming here. And from those fractures, personal tragedies would gradually emerge silent, yet irreversible. In classical Hollywood, a contract was not merely a professional agreement. It was a long-term binding pledge, written in dry legal language, yet carrying the weight of a sentence. For young actors, the moment of signing an exclusive contract was often described as the turning point of their lives. Few understood that from that moment on, they no longer fully belonged to themselves. These contracts allowed studios to own an artist's time, image, and future decisions. An actor could be shifted from leading roles to supporting ones, from rising star to forgotten name, through a single administrative decision. If they refused a role, they could be suspended without pay, yet the suspension period would still be added to the contract's duration. A closed loop with no escape, where resistance only tightened the chains. Fame, which Hollywood promoted as the ultimate reward, in reality became its most effective instrument of control. Once an actor had grown accustomed to the spotlight and public recognition, the fear of losing everything became overwhelming. The studios understood this perfectly. They did not need open threats. A subtle reminder that opportunities were limited and replacements always available was enough. For many artists, especially women, contracts extended far beyond career control and deeply invaded personal life. Weight, hairstyle, clothing, even private relationships could become unwritten terms. Pregnancy could be treated as a contract violation. Divorce could be labeled a scandal. Any change that deviated from the flawless script was seen as a threat to the brand the studio claimed to own. The injustice of this system was not always visible. It hid behind lavish parties, glowing press coverage, and glamorous premieres. The public saw wealth and glory, but not the closed-door meetings where human destinies were decided as coldly as figures on a planning chart. For those who dared to speak up, the consequences were almost guaranteed. They were labeled difficult, removed from major projects, isolated from networks of power. Hollywood did not need official blacklists. The industry's collective silence was enough to erase a career. And when that happened, the very contracts that once promised protection became shackles, making departure nearly impossible. What is most heartbreaking is that many artists accepted this as an inevitable part of the dream. They believed pain was the price of success. That personal sacrifice was necessary to achieve immortality on screen. But over time, that bargain began to erode the psyche. The loss of control, the feeling of being owned and replaceable, pushed many into prolonged anxiety, depression, and deep self-doubt. Classical Hollywood created immortal icons, but it also left behind a generation of artists carrying invisible wounds. The contracts once praised as gateways to glory were in truth doors that closed off freedom. And within that suffocating space, tragedy did not arrive as a sudden shock. It emerged as the inevitable consequence of a system built on the sacrifice of human lives. In classical Hollywood, beauty was not a gift. It was an obligation. For female stars, appearance did not merely determine their careers. It became an internal mechanism through which the system controlled them. Beauty was publicly celebrated, yet simultaneously surveilled, dissected, and exploited to exhaustion. Every face on the screen was the product of countless decisions in which the woman who owned that face was not allowed to participate. Hollywood constructed an ideal female image, both seductive and pure, both strong and obedient. But such an image did not exist in real life. To sustain the illusion, Female stars were forced to sacrifice themselves piece by piece. Weight was strictly controlled. Age became the enemy. Wrinkles were forbidden. And any sign of imperfection was treated as a flaw that needed correction. This control did not stop at the surface. It quietly but thoroughly invaded private life. Many actresses entered Hollywood at a very young age, lacking life experience and almost entirely without protective support systems. In an environment where power was absolutely concentrated, the boundary between opportunity and abuse became blurred. Demands went unwritten in contracts. Suggestions were disguised as career advice, and choices appeared voluntary, while in reality being made in situations where there was no way out. What deepened the tragedy was enforced silence. Speaking out meant losing one's career. Resisting meant being labeled difficult. And in an industry where image was everything, a single rumor could be enough to erase a person entirely. As a result, many female stars chose endurance. They smiled on red carpets, appeared flawless before the camera, while inside they carried fear, trauma, and a profound sense of betrayal. Hollywood did not merely demand silence, it normalized it. The press of the era rarely questioned the power structures behind the glamour. Painful stories were dismissed as baseless rumors. The public was guided to believe that when a star collapsed, it was due to personal weakness, an inability to withstand the pressure of success. Individual responsibility was emphasized, while the power structures that caused harm remained protected. For many women, the consequences extended far beyond damaged careers. They distorted entire lives. Unacknowledged trauma accumulated over time, leading to depression, addiction, and a loss of self-worth. They were seen everywhere, yet truly heard by no one. Loneliness became an inseparable part of fame. Classical Hollywood demanded that female stars remain forever young. When they no longer fit the ideal image, the system readily turned its back. Those once praised as icons of beauty were swiftly replaced, without explanation, without support. The silence lingered long after the lights went out, as many of them faded into obscurity, carrying stories that were never fully told. The most tragic part of this story lies not in individual cruelty, but in how an entire system allowed it to exist. Hollywood built its success on the image of the perfect woman, yet never allowed those women to be fully human. And in the space between image and reality, countless lives were quietly suffocated by silence. What happened to the female stars of classical Hollywood is not merely a story of the past. It is a warning about the cost of unchecked power and about the danger of a culture that worships images over people. Those wounds, though hidden for decades, have left deep marks on the history of cinema and on the collective memory of the world. Classical Hollywood did not merely create fame. It created a particular psychological state in which people were forced to live in constant tension between their public image and their inner selves. When the spotlight reached its peak, many stars discovered that they had never felt more alone. Admired by millions, yet with no space to be weak, to make mistakes, or to simply be themselves. Fame in Hollywood did not arrive in fragments. It came like a tidal wave, sweeping away all personal boundaries. Stars lived under relentless schedules, constant surveillance, and nonstop judgment of every gesture and expression. There was no pause to recover, no time to adapt to the new person they were compelled to become. The lights never truly went out, even after they left the studio. In such an environment, depression was never named. It was concealed behind gentler terms: fatigue, stress, nervous exhaustion. Film studios were not concerned with causes. They cared only about outcomes. As long as an actor could still appear before the camera with a flawless smile, everything else was considered secondary. Genuine emotion became something to be managed, not healed, controlled, so it would not disrupt the machinery of production. Addiction emerged as a false escape. Alcohol, sedatives, and stimulants were used not for pleasure, but for survival. They dulled anxiety, extended endurance, and created a temporary sense of control. But over time, those substances became new chains. A vicious cycle in which artists depended on chemicals to sustain the image Hollywood demanded of them. The most painful aspect was an isolation that could not be shared. Stars did not know whom to trust. Friends might be colleagues, but they could just as easily be rivals. The press was no place for vulnerability. Family, if present at all, was often distant both geographically and emotionally. And in an industry where weakness was equated with failure, seeking help became a dangerous act. Many stars began to lose their sense of self. They no longer knew who they were outside of their familiar roles. When they were not working, they felt empty. When they were working, they were exhausted. Existence itself became entirely defined by the gaze of others. And when that gaze shifted or grew, cruel psychological collapse followed swiftly and without mercy. Classical Hollywood had no language for mental health, no support systems, no official acknowledgement that human beings have limits. Those who could not withstand the pressure were labeled unstable, difficult, or self-destructive. Few asked whether the system itself was the root cause of these tragedies. The psychological breakdowns of stars did not happen in a single moment. They were the result of years spent stretched thin between expectation and silence. Every premiere, every glowing article, every round of applause came with a piece of energy taken away. And when there was nothing left to give, they became more fragile than ever in a world that had never allowed them to stop. This part of the story has no dramatic climax. It is a prolonged quiet where tragedy unfolds internally, silently yet persistently. It reminds us that glamour, no matter how radiant, can never replace psychological safety or human connection. And when those are taken away, the price is not merely a career, but the very ability to exist as a whole human being. Classical Hollywood could not exist without the media, but the relationship between the two was never a simple symbiosis. It was an unspoken pact in which truth was selectively chosen, reshaped, and at times entirely sacrificed in order to protect the flawless illusion that the industry sold to the world. For decades, entertainment journalism did not stand outside Hollywood's power structure. Newspapers, magazines, and major press outlets depended on film studios for access to stars, exclusive images, and compelling stories. In return, they accepted an invisible boundary: certain things were simply not to be written about. Personal tragedies, psychological trauma, abuse, and mental collapse were treated as threats to the machinery of dreams. When a star entered crisis, the story was rarely told in full. Instead, it was softened, individualized, or distorted. Depression became moodiness. Addiction was framed as moral failure. Unexplained deaths were reduced to the word accident. Everything was presented in a way that absolved the system of responsibility, while placing the entire burden of blame on the individual. The media did not merely remain silent. In many cases, It actively constructed alternative narratives. Glowing profiles, carefully staged interviews, meticulously controlled photographs. The public was guided to believe that everything was fine, that the glamour remained intact, that if something went wrong, it was because the person was not strong enough to carry success. This complicity created a dangerous feedback loop. When the public saw only a curated version of reality, they continued to uphold unrealistic expectations. And those expectations, in turn, became pressure crushing the very stars struggling to survive. Hollywood and the media together maintained a stage where pain was hidden and image was valued above humanity. What is most disturbing is that this concealment did not only protect power, it isolated victims. Those who were suffering had no space to speak. They found no empathy in headlines, no validation that what they were experiencing was real. In that silence, many began to doubt their own perceptions, a deep form of psychological harm that was rarely named. Even when tragedy could no longer be fully hidden, the narrative remained tightly controlled. The media focused on sensational details while avoiding systemic analysis. Individuals were dissected, while the structures of power behind them remained invisible. This allowed Hollywood to continue operating without confronting the hardest question of all: who was truly responsible for the lives quietly destroyed? Over time, the repetition of these distorted stories eroded trust. Looking back, people began to notice vast gaps in Hollywood's history, unanswered questions, details deliberately omitted, and a growing sense that behind every legend, there might exist an entirely different truth. This part of the story forces the audience to examine its own role, because the media does not merely reflect Hollywood, it reflects public desire. The desire to believe in perfection. The desire to be entertained without confronting darkness. And that desire itself helped sustain a culture in which tragedy was concealed in exchange for collective comfort. Classical Hollywood could not remain silent on its own. It required others to be silent with it. And within that prolonged silence, countless personal tragedies were buried, leaving behind a legacy that makes it impossible to look back at film history without asking what the true cost of glamour really was. Classical Hollywood was built on dreams of immortality. Yet the bitter paradox is that many of the people who created those dreams disappeared in silence, leaving behind deaths that were quickly forgotten or rewritten to fit the myth the industry sought to protect. During the golden age of American cinema, the death of a star was rarely presented as the consequence of a system. Instead, it was framed as an isolated accident, a personal tragedy, or an inexplicable ending that required no further examination. Every press release, every brief news item aimed to close the story as quickly as possible, before dangerous questions could take shape. Many deaths were officially recorded as accidents, but behind them lay long histories of exhaustion, dependence on sedatives, psychological pressure, and profound isolation. Bodies found in hotel rooms, cars, or quiet houses in Los Angeles were described in neutral, emotionless language. No one spoke of the years of control, exploitation, or of being forced to smile for the camera long after the spirit had collapsed. Suicide, when it could no longer be concealed, was often blurred by evasive language. The press spoke of fragility, of unnamed sadness, but rarely of the environment that pushed people to their final limits. Hollywood did not want to acknowledge that it itself could be a dangerous space for those who no longer fit the image of perfection. Most disturbing of all was the speed with which these deaths were absorbed and erased from collective memory. Within weeks, a star who had once filled movie screens became a footnote in film history. Studios continued production. Premieres went on. The lights stayed on. The machine never stopped long enough to mourn beyond what was strictly necessary. For the public of that era, these deaths were often received as distant tragedies, unrelated to power structures or industrial culture. Audiences were encouraged to feel sympathy, but not to ask questions. Grief was a safe emotion. Anger or doubt was seen as a threat to the dream. Over time, as documents were declassified and memoirs and historical studies emerged, a different picture began to appear. These deaths no longer stood alone. They were connected by recurring patterns: excessive control, isolation, lack of mental health support, and a culture that treated human beings as replaceable assets. The forgotten stars did not only lose their lives, they lost the right to tell their own stories. When the truth was buried with them, Hollywood preserved its flawless image, but at the cost of losing a part of its own humanity from history. This part of the story is not about condemning individual people or specific studios. It asks the audience to pause and consider a larger question. Can an industry create beauty, inspiration, and great art if the price is silence in the face of the pain and deaths of the very people who make it possible? And if so, is that price truly acceptable? And it is in these forgotten deaths that Hollywood reveals its true face. Not under the lights, but in the shadows behind the scenes, where fame ends and truth begins. Not all victims of classical Hollywood died. Some survived. But survival rarely meant victory. For many stars, leaving the spotlight was not a liberation, but the beginning of a quiet, broken life marked by obscurity and forgetting. When contracts were terminated, when youth faded, or when they no longer fit the image studios had constructed for them, those who once stood at the center of the American dream were pushed to the margins with cold efficiency. There were no transition plans, no psychological support, and often not enough money to begin again. What remained was only a former fame and a heavy burden of memories they no longer knew how to carry. Many tried to go on under a different name, in another city, or in jobs completely unrelated to the arts. But the past did not disappear easily. The fame that once surrounded them became a long shadow, one that prevented them from fully blending in, while constantly reminding them of what had been lost. They were no longer seen as ordinary people, yet no longer treated as stars. Some sought refuge in marriage, hoping that family life might mend what had been fractured inside. But the psychological pressure accumulated over years of control, exploitation, and enforced silence often made intimate relationships fragile. Divorce, isolation, and a sense of personal failure became the next chapters of their lives, chapters rarely known to the public. There were those who lived to old age but never truly escaped Hollywood. They carried with them habits formed within the old system: fear of judgment, a need for validation, and the belief that personal worth existed only when there was an audience. Even long after the lights had gone out, the stage remained alive in their minds. The most painful aspect is history's silence. Survivors were rarely invited to tell their stories while they were still alive. When they did speak, if they ever did, it was often too late, when memories had faded or were met with doubt. Hollywood continued to celebrate its golden age, while the real people behind it slowly vanished from collective memory. This part of the film does not seek spectacle or grand tragedy. It lingers instead on prolonged lives, on existence after fame, where there is no triumphant music, no stage lights, only human beings left to face themselves. In this slowness, the audience is invited to see Hollywood from another angle, not through its dazzling moments, but through the years that follow when the dream has passed and its true cost finally comes into view. And it is there that the film's central question becomes clearer than ever. What remains when the lights go out, and was fame ever enough to compensate for a life spent in exchange for it? When the classical studio system collapsed, Hollywood declared that it had entered a new era. Lifetime contracts were abolished, actors gained the right to choose their roles, and the media began speaking openly about creative freedom and individual rights. Yet a more important question remained. Had the nature of power truly changed, or had it simply put on a more sophisticated disguise? Look closely at how the industry operates today, and Hollywood no longer appears to be ruled by moguls sitting behind closed doors. But power is still concentrated in the hands of a few. The difference is that it is now dispersed across production companies, distribution platforms, media outlets, and social networks. Where pressure once came from contracts, it now comes from algorithms, public opinion, and the constant threat of being replaced in a more ruthless market than ever before. Stories that were buried during the Golden Age have gradually resurfaced, not because Hollywood suddenly awakened, but because the world outside it changed. Social movements, long-delayed accusations, and the courage of survivors forced the industry to confront itself. Yet these changes often arrived only after irreparable damage had been done, after too many lives had already been crushed in silence. What is most troubling is that many old mechanisms still exist in new forms. The utilization of fame, a culture that worships success at any cost, and the equation of human worth with profitability remain the foundation of Hollywood. Young people entering the entertainment industry today may have more freedom, but they also face a different kind of control, more subtle, less visible, and harder to resist. Hollywood has learned how to tell flattering stories about itself, but it has been far slower to heal its historical wounds. Films that pay tribute to the past often celebrate the glamour, rarely giving adequate space to the human cost behind it. As a result, toxic legacies do not disappear. They are quietly passed from one generation to the next. This section does not claim that Hollywood has not changed. It has, but not in simple or absolute ways. Instead, it poses a moral question for today's audience. As we continue to consume mass-produced dreams, are we unknowingly sustaining a system once built on silence, or are we conscious enough to demand a more humane industry? And perhaps the greatest legacy of classical Hollywood does not lie in its immoral films, but in the painful lesson that fame, when not governed by ethics and responsibility, will always find a way to repeat its tragedies, no matter the era. When the studio lights go dark, when the final melodies of classical Hollywood slowly fade into memory, what remains is not only timeless films or celebrated cultural icons. What remains is a persistent, haunting question that runs through the history of the entertainment industry. What is the true cost of the dream, and who paid it? Hollywood was built on art, but also on power. For decades, these two forces moved side by side, sustaining one another and, at times, destroying one another. Art offered emotion, hope, and escape to millions. Power, when left unchecked, distorted those ideals, turning people into instruments, talent into assets, and silence into a condition for survival. The stars who were destroyed in silence were not exceptions. They were the inevitable products of a system that placed profit above human dignity. Tragically, most of these stories were only fully recognized when it was already too late, when fame had faded, when lives had taken irreversible turns, when death or disappearance closed chapters that were never allowed to be fully told. This collective silence did not come only from those in positions of authority, but from society as a whole. Audiences were intoxicated by glamour. The media reinforced the myth, and the suffering behind the scenes was treated as an acceptable price for entertainment. Within that cycle, responsibility became diluted, and no one truly stood accountable in the end. Looking back at classical Hollywood is not an attempt to deny its artistic achievements, but to understand that every legacy carries a shadow. Great films cannot erase the lives that were damaged. And admiration, when stripped of awareness, can become a form of unconscious complicity. This conclusion does not seek to deliver a verdict, nor to identify a single villain. Instead, it invites viewers to pause, reflect, and imagine themselves in the place of those who once stood beneath the blazing lights. They were not merely symbols, not merely roles, but human beings with fears, desires, and fragile limits. Perhaps the greatest lesson Hollywood leaves behind is not found in its dazzling images, but in a quiet reminder: art is only truly great when it is built on respect for human life. When power is no longer concealed by glamour, and when silence is no longer the price of survival, the dream may finally have a chance to become more humane. And when the film ends, the question remains with us. Will we continue to admire the dream at any cost, or will we have the courage to face the price that was once hidden behind it?